Second Timothy proves that all scripture is God breathed. In other words, there should not be 40 authors from multiple countries writing his word. In other words, they were the ones who added and took away from his word by adding in original Greek and original Hebrew to something that was written in Ge'ez. That's why it says Ethiopia has the oldest, most complete Bible on earth. Therefore, it was written in Ge'ez, and in it, it warned us about the Greek kingdom. So don't forget that the entire European monarchy are all related to each other because they are all descendants of Cleopatra and the Greek kingdom, which includes Jerusalem, Rome, Egypt, Syria, Iran, Iraq, and all of Asia. In other words, the Greek kingdom controls all those nations. So they basically took the words from Ge'ez and created a bunch of Abrahamic religions, which leads you to nowhere because they all have half a story, and none of them will lead you to the real King of Kings. Not only that, they went to Ethiopia and implanted their Orthodox churches, their Protestant churches, and their Roman Catholic churches centuries before the real King of Kings was crowned king. So the real King of Kings had to deny being God because that's one of the things that's mentioned within their ceremonies. Not only that, he had to be called the defender of their faith, while their faith is basically leading you away from God himself. So they created an Old and New Testament format in the 1600s, 1600s, and they put the future in the past. So they want you to believe that the root of David, also known as God himself, died thousands of years ago, even though you will not find any remains of King David anywhere on earth. Why? Because he's supposed to be here during the latter years. So let's read. In the time of David, David was chosen out of the children of Israel. He played with lions as with kids, and we all know Selassie had lions. The Most High Lord. So he set up the horn of his people, and we all know that Ethiopia is a horn of Africa. So look what it said. A remnant unto Jacob, and out of him a root unto David. Remember, David is supposed to be here in the latter years. So what does it says? He lifted up his stone and sling and beat down the boasting of Goliath. So who did that? David. So let's watch who David is.
It is good that you are here to record this picture of me in my palace garden at Addis Ababa. People who see this throughout the world will realize that even in the 20th century, with space.
In the 20th century, in other words, he was crowned King of Kings in the 20th century. You're literally looking at King David, the root unto David, whom is Jacob. And we all know that Jacob is God himself.
Right, and the just cause, David will still beat Goliath.
David is considered the firstborn. So let's watch. But God does not withdraw his mercy. So he gave to Jacob a remnant, to David a root from his own family. In other words, Jacob is David. So let's read. And I will make him my firstborn. My covenant will I not break, nor alter the thing that is gone out of my lips, once I have sworn by my holiness that I would not lie on to David. Remember, he's his firstborn. So who also is the firstborn? Jacob. God acknowledged him as the firstborn. Remember, it's Haile Selassie the first, who goes by the name of Jacob. And from him was to spring the man who won the favor of all dear to God and men, Moses. In other words, Moses is the son of Jacob. Moses is Joseph, because we all know that Jacob has 12 sons. So instead of, you never hear that Moses is part of the 12 tribes. Why? Because his name is Joseph. And Jacob is David. They're both the firstborn. So when are they supposed to be here? So Jesus was the successor of Moses in the time of the Most High, in the time of the Mighty One, in the time also of Moses. So Moses is together with Jesus, and he followed the Mighty One. And the Mighty One is King David himself. the Holy One, the Most High, the Lord forever, and a throne of glory in Israel. And after him rose up a wise son, Solomon. In other words, Solomon is supposed to be here and the latter times. So let's watch what happened. In 1962, a new Amharic translation from Ge'ez was printed. From Ge'ez. It was only translated from Ge'ez. Why? Realizing that there ought to be a revision from the original Hebrew and Greek of the existing translation of the Bible. In other words, they made up an 81 book Bible, and he was like, no, it should only be 72 books. That's why he says this. In his Bible, you will find 1 and 2 Esdras. So remember, all Bibles are translated out of the original tongues, and with it, you will find the books of Esdras. And if you have the books of Esdras, you'll realize that Solomon is Moses. Because we all know that Moses built the ark. And it was not built in the church, so it's not in the church in Ethiopia. It's built where? The holy ark of the Lord in the house that King David, Solomon, the son of David, had built. In other words, Solomon is Moses. Solomon also goes by the name of David. So he has a son called Jesus, and Jesus has sons also. So of the sons of Jesus, the son of Josedek, who also goes by the name of Moses. So you notice that Jesus is together with Moses. So Esdras, who's Moses, bring the law of Moses that was given of the Lord God of Israel on the first day of the 7th month, with the God Most High, Almighty, and all the people, also Jesus. So Jesus is there with his sons in the latter times. Why? Because I, Esdras, received a charge of the Lord upon the Mount Oreb, or Mount Sinai, that I should go unto Israel. But when I came unto them, they sought me at naught, and despised the commandment of the Lord. So look for your shepherd that shall come in the end of the world. In other words, it's supposed to be here in the latter years. That's why it states this. Jesus was the son of Sirach and grandchild to Jesus. So the first Jesus is here in the latter years, and call home again almost after all the prophets in the latter times. In other words, in the story Star Witness, Jesus currently is 33 years old. So he should have a son by now. And in 2049, he should be a grandfather. So let's watch what Selassie said on December 25th, 1968. Because people are saying that Selassie follows Jesus. So when Jesus was born from Virgin Mary, from that time on, he lived an exemplary life. A life which man everywhere must emulate. This life and the faith which he has taught us assures us of salvation. In other words, he's telling you he made a good example that other people should follow. But he himself follows the commandments. So my advice to all is to fulfill the 10 commandments. You are aware of the contents of the 10 commandments and can elaborate on it. If the nation for which I am the emperor follows and accepts this, since it's also what I accept and follow. In other words, he wants you to follow the Almighty One. He doesn't want you to follow Jesus. So that's why he tells him this. I would tell a person who was considering the claim of Christ for the first time that it is necessary to have faith in the Almighty. In other words, the God of Israel comes first. That's why the 10 Commandments says this. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. So ask yourself, did Jesus bring anybody out of the land of Egypt? Out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make yourself a carved image. So are people, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven. So are people praying to a painting that's supposedly of someone living in heaven above? Yes. So that's what people are doing now. For I, the Lord, your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me. In other words, we are living in the generations of Jacob and Joseph. So it goes to Jacob, who is the root on to David. Then it goes to Joseph, then Jesus' sons, Ezer and Sirach, and then Sirach will have a son called Jesus. So that's why it says, to the fourth generations of those who hate me. In other words, he's been here since 1892. So it'll be, we are literally like in the fourth generation, third, fourth generation right now. So let's watch what he says. As prayers are said in churches, the same is done in mosques. The house of God is open and welcome those who comes with charity. Following this principle, since as Muslims and Christians are all loyal to Ethiopia, if anybody says difference exists between Muslims and Christians, that person is an enemy to Ethiopia. In other words, in the beginning, it was one God and no religion. So regardless if you call yourself a Muslim or a Christian, you still have to pray to the one God. So they obviously have different gods, but they all have one God in common, and that's the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And who is he? The King of Kings.
After his father died, he became governor of the province. In 1928, he led the troops that killed Empress Zoditu's husband, who was not of royal blood, and became regent. He became emperor on November 2nd, 1930, and was crowned Haile Selassie I, King of Kings, King of Zion, conquering lion of the seed of Judah, power of the Trinity.
Your Imperial Majesty, you were 39 years old when you were crowned in 1930.